Well, I want to cover a topic that I've alluded to quite a bit, and I've kind of glanced over throughout many of my videos, but I wanted to kind of address it head on, and that is the uh, argument that government is providing a vital function in the form of providing services that are so-called public good services, and usually there's a correlation here also with the claim that it's providing them because they can't be provided uh, apps government, that they are, quote, market failures. And right off the bat, there's kind of I would say two categories of public goods, and one of them are actual consumer goods and capital goods, and they're actual services. So these would be like roads and healthcare, and whatever, food. And then there's another class which are basically just abstract. So law, peace, security, or at least that's how there's a claim basically that absent the state, certain ephemeral things would simply not be present in society, and we'd all to our detriment. So now that latter category, I don't really think exists, because I think everything can boil down to actual consumer goods. Defense is going to boil down to some kind of martial material, on the lock on your door, and law is going to boil down to arbitration and restitution and restitutionary enforcement and so on and so forth. Also, those notions that the government in some metaphysical sense enables society, those are almost impossible to disprove. Because who's to say? I mean, there might be some mysterious force that there's no evidence for that somehow would validate it. But on the same token that it's almost impossible to disprove, it's also, I mean, you could point to societies that don't have states, but then you can always just say, well, circumstances are different, which surely they are. But not only are they impossible to disprove, they really don't have any evidence to suggest that they're true either. There's no proof for them. They're just too vague. But the first category that I mentioned, the public goods, the actual physical goods, that's actually quite a bit more concrete. Now, in many of my videos, especially the ones dealing with ancient societies, and my recent ones come to mind here, I talk about government expenditures that are just, it would be absurd on their face to characterize them as helping the public or being for the good of anybody other than the rulers or the government generally. And examples like this, it's palaces, a lot of military spending is very dubious in terms of discipline. I mean, all offensive military action is by definition not for the good of the people, and that's at least the minimum half of all military activity in the world is offensive, at least half. And we can just go, I mean, there's lots, I mean, depending on the scale, we can come up with a list that's almost infinite. And, I could make, not just me, anyone could just spend hundreds or thousands of videos where all we do is list the government expenditures that are highly dubious or totally obviously no benefit to the people, either because they don't confer any obvious benefit, or because they're actually directed against the populace. So, the Berlin Wall, which I think was actually called the Fascist Defense Wall or something like that, it's clearly designed to keep East Germans in. And it's clearly designed to prevent them from leaving. There's no way you could look at that and say that's for their own good. No, and I mean, the list of things like that is pretty long, and then there's, of course, like I said, the list of things that maybe are directly, when the pharaoh builds a pyramid, he's not building the pyramid to oppress his people, probably. Who knows? I could think of, psychological reasons why you would, and to overawe them or whatever, to demonstrate your power. But essentially it's just a tube for him, and so it's a huge waste. But he's not actually directing it at the people. But the counter argument here is that, well, yes, it's true that there are obviously things that the government does either in the past or currently that are not good, or that I wouldn't. This is the argument you're going to get from the statists, socialists, whatever. But then you stupid libertarian who just don't understand, are ignoring all the quote good things that the government does. No, there's two problems with the argument here. One being more fatal to the position than the other. The first one, the less fatal of the two, is that argument does not include any cost accounting at all. So there's no attempt, and I've never ever heard anyone attempt to do this, to say, okay, well let's grant, for the sake of argument, that yes, some things the government does is good for the populace and some things aren't, which I think pretty much anyone would agree with. Any statist would have to concede that some things are bad, but they think some things are good. Well, you have to come up with some kind of formula, some kind of rhetorical basis for concluding how much has to be actual public goods and how much can be government waste. So if for instance, just to use the example I'm using quite a bit here, if the pyramids don't count as public works and are government waste, but say roads and canals are public works, how much does the government have to spend on the latter to compensate for the spending on the former? So if the Pharaoh spent 99% of state revenue on pyramids and 1% on public goods, actual conceded public goods, would that be enough to justify the state in that situation? My guess would be you'd have to say no, but I don't know, because the people who make this argument, as far as I can tell, they're just categorically opposed to not having a state, to the point where anything that might justify it is considered sufficient. And so I don't know. It would sound absurd to me to say, yeah, as long as 1% of government expenditure is for public goods, it doesn't matter if the other 99% is just for the vanity of the ruler. I kind of find it hard to believe somebody would say that, but I've never heard them actually come up. I've never heard any person come up with any kind of rubric for deciding how much the government needs to spend and how much it can't spend, how much is acceptable. I would imagine a really sophisticated person would come up with something that would probably shift by societies. The older societies, they had less capital per person, so there's a lot lower marginal productivity per hour of labor, and so in antiquity you couldn't have a 99% tax rate, because if someone took 99% of your income, which would be crops, basically, you would be dead. You would starve to death. But we're in a position now where if someone took 99% of your income, you'd be in, a bad position, but you wouldn't starve. And a lot of people would even have relative comfort compared to the rest of history. So the marginal tax rate can be a lot higher. But so would that mean that, in ancient Egypt, the king would have to spend almost everything on public works, but now we can afford to, waste more? Bottom line, I've never even heard of the argument made. The fact that it's never been made implies to me that, to the person who would make the public works argument but acknowledges that some things are waste, their position would have to be that it's irrelevant as long as there's some public goods. It doesn't matter how much waste there is going on, because otherwise they'd have to have some kind of basis for saying so much waste is too much, or not enough public work. Now, that's conceding, though, that what the government does and claims to be public works are actually public works. Unfortunately, this is far from the case. The people who make this argument do not have any kind of convincing rubric to decide whether something actually is a public works. The first kind of criteria, I guess you could have, would be if the government says so. But this is a pretty erroneous basis, because the government can plausibly claim just about anything as a public works. For instance, the building of vast palatial estates for the ruler, which is a very, very common. I mean, I've mentioned Louis XIV, but the Assyrian kings, the Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Greek, everybody, the Roman villas, everybody, everywhere, the Forbidden City, every monarch, and even non-monarchs will build themselves personal residences of, undreamed opulence relative to the rest of the people, or even to history in general. And that might seem like something that's obviously not a public works, but they could just say, look, I'm showing off the wealth of this country. I'm impressing foreigners about how wealthy and powerful we are. The Assyrians, really explicitly, they'd have ambassadors come to their palaces, and of course they carve images of the Assyrian armies, raping and pillaging, and the idea would be that they would intimidate foreigners. And so you could make the argument that, well, the claim could be put forward that even though this is for just the king to live in, or his harem or something, like the sultans in the Ottoman Empire will build huge palaces just for, one or two of their women in their harem, or for one of their sons or something. They're not even people who had any ostensive role in government whatsoever, but they could say it's to improve our image abroad. And so I don't think that the government claiming that something is for the common good is a sufficient reason or justification for actually concluding that that's what it is. Now, the second, I've never actually heard anybody explicitly make that argument, but it's implied with a lot of people say, because they can point look, the congressman says that this is to help the economy. Well, just because he says that that's the case, and that he's giving, his donor a huge subsidy or whatever, doesn't mean that it's the case. The second and more common and a little bit harder to refute argument, because it has a grain of plausibility, is the use argument. So the government builds something and people use it, and so this is justification that it is actually a public good, and the government made the correct choice in that investment. Now, the problem with this argument is there's usually no rubric to decide how much is it being used, because it should be evident that if it's not getting very much use, then its claim that it's worthwhile is highly dubious. And an example here that I actually got in what was it? It was a college class. I want to say sociology, but I'm sure it wasn't. It was like political science. I don't remember what the name of the class was, but we watched a documentary on new state after the fall of colonialism, and kind of like the first big state to get away was Ghana. Ghana was able to leave British colonialism, and their leader was a guy by the name of Kwame Nkrumah. And they were saying that they got their independence in the mid '50s, I want to say, and they didn't say it, but these guys are nationalists, and they're big Keynesians, and they wanted to show off this new government, the new independent government's prowess. And so one of the ways governments do this through military action and then through big public works projects. And this is what Ghana did. And among other things, they built a freeway, 2 lanes each way, separated by a corridor, real common in the States. And they connected to, I don't know if they were the main cities or what, but 2 cities. I don't know how long it was, maybe 100 miles, something like that. It wasn't like a 3,000-mile road or anything like that. But this was back in the 50s. Well, they were interviewing somebody in the present, which would have been probably in the late 90s or the early 2000s. Then he's sitting there, and the road's in the background. The road's vacant. It's in good shape. It's not full of potholes or anything, but it's vacant. And every once in a while, you'd see one car go one direction. And the moderator was basically saying, look, there isn't really that much commerce between these 2 cities. There aren't really that many cars in Ghana, certainly back then, but even now. And the volume of traffic that is known and ever has been thought to exist between these 2 cities would be serviced by a decent 2-lane dirt road. Not a 1-lane road. Because a 1-lane road would be a little congested, but like a 2-lane dirt road would do the trick. And yet, the Ghanese government, the Kwame Nkrumah, spent an enormously greater sum and used far more resources to build this 4-lane freeway, basically, that very few people use. Now, some people use it, and so John Kenneth Galbraith and the Canadians and the public works statists out there will say, look, someone's using it, so it was justified. But the cost was astronomical compared to the need. And, the need is demonstrated by the people's willingness to use it. And even though this road is free, not very many people use it. So if people had to directly pay for it, it would never have been built. So the point here is that just because the government builds something and some people use it does not mean that it was justified. And we can illustrate this with examples like the one I just gave and say, well, look, here's something that they spent all this money on, and very few people use it. And usually where we have available information on how much the government spends on a given utility, and we can say, look, they're spending more than any conceivable sum would be spent by the people who are using it. In order for Kwame Nkrumah's highway to be justified, each person who would drive on it would have to pay a $500,000 toll or something. I mean, I'm picking that number arbitrarily, but and there's no reason to assume that would if they could travel cheaper in a golden chariot, that's probably not their preferred means. Now, even there though, it's kind of subjective because we start drawing. Well, okay, what if instead of only occasional cars, there were a decent amount of traffic, and then you look on most of the roads in the United States, not most of the roads, but many of the roads in the United States, there's a lot of traffic, and so it's easy to look and say, well, a lot of people are using them. Or if we want to look at like Hammurabi or the Babylonians, they would build canals, and I'm sure people would use them. And so you say, well, some people are using them, so it was justified. But the question is, would the people using them be willing to actually front the entire cost or not? And if not, then it's a misallocation of resources. It's a waste of resources. It's a drain. It's a net drain on society. If you look at the roads in the United States, I mean, there's very little in terms of market orientation to their construction. Now, there are places where they know there's really high volume, and so they will build more roads, but they don't do a good job about it because there's super congestion. This is one of the things that people complain about congestion, but they don't realize that it is directly stemming from government involvement. When you have that many people trying to use the roads, any entrepreneur sees the opportunity to either build another one or charge higher rates. I mean, if it's so full, if you're selling a product and people can't get enough of it, then you can raise your price. And yeah, then fewer people will buy it, but you'll still make the same because you'll be charging a higher price and you'll reach a happy medium. But if it's free, you can't do that. Free, and as free as anything government does is free. So the roads in the United States, so most of them are not even used that often. If you live in a rural area, you'll notice that they're basically just built in a grid pattern. I mean, they are not everywhere. When I drive out west, there are a lot fewer roads than there are out east. But like in Michigan, and like Ohio, and the Midwest generally, and even in Texas, the parts in East Texas where I spend most of my time, the roads are basically laid out in a grid pattern. I mean, let's make roads every mile, or every 2 miles, or whatever. If there's like a mountain in the way, or a big river or a lake, obviously they won't build a bridge over it necessarily, but they just build a grid, like a big checkerboard. Like, what a waste. People don't live in a checkerboard. People only are living in certain valleys, in certain regions, and they just build like this giant net over the whole continent, over thousands and thousands of square miles. They build millions of miles of roads, most of which is just, let's connect point A and point B, and again. It's not organic at all. It's totally arbitrary. It's like something you'd see in Tron with a grid, whereas naturally the roads are going to grow like roots or something, where they're going to connect major centers where there's a lot of commerce between them are going to be connected. So, like, There's probably going to be many, many different transportation conduits, whether they be roads, railroads, airports, canals, whatever, subways, high-speed trains, between big cities. Between Detroit and Chicago, between Chicago and LA, between New York and whatever. And then there's going to be less transportation hubs between less active areas economically. There could be an area where nobody lives, but there's an enormous amount of economic activity. There could be other areas where there's no economic activity, but a lot of people live there. Either way, you're going to get transportation hubs going to develop there. It's not just going to be, let's build a grid everywhere, and then you're going to have 95% of the grid being almost no traffic. If you go out where I live in Michigan, there's a town, and in town there's traffic. And you go out of town, and the roads are basically almost vacant most of the time. Even there is no such thing as rush hour. If we were to sit there with a clicker, you'd find a couple dozen cars a day in most places. And yet they built roads literally everywhere. Economically speaking, there probably could be 1/10 as many roads. Then there'd be decent traffic on it, but then those same roads would then be really well upkept. The roads don't get plowed, they don't get repaired, there are potholes in them because they just build them everywhere. So all this is to say that just because somebody's driving on them, because some people use them in their commute, doesn't mean that it was a justified expense in the first place. The only rubric that we have, this is not just the Austrians, by the way, this is any sound economist will say that the only way you know that it's worth it is if people voluntarily pay for it. The only way we could tell, people just tend to think of government projects as like a gift from heaven, like a giant syringe came down from space and injected, roads or bridges or whatever. When really it's a transaction. It's a transfer of wealth. The government expropriates wealth either through direct taxation or just direct expropriation, or through inflation, which ultimately is the same thing. They redistribute resources to themselves by printing money. They transfer those resources from us to them, and then they use it obsessively for our benefit, but really, if you analyze it, it's always for their own political gain. Literally every single time. But it is a transfer. And government transfers are based on coercion, they're based on taxation and the threat of force. No matter how infrequently it's exercised, although it's exercised fairly frequently, just look on YouTube every once in a while. You can spend all day watching coercion of innocent people by the police, bearing in mind always that the vast majority of videos you will never see and the vast majority of incidents are never recorded. The only rubric to decide whether a transaction is for the benefit of both parties is if they both agree. If A and B, if A does something against B's will and coerces them, then that's a very hard case to make that it was for both of their mutual self-interest. If, however, they agree to an exchange, then we can say, oh, well, then at least ex ante, at least in the at the point when the decision was made, they believed that it was in their benefit. Now, it's always possible to regret a decision later. That's certainly the case. That happens in free markets. It happens with governments, too, though, so it's not something to say that, oh, free markets, people might regret a decision later. Yeah, well, the French probably regretted that they built the Maginot Line later, but whatever. Unless both parties are agreeing that the basis for concluding that the non-agreeing, the non-consenting party is benefiting is extremely dubious. Absolutely extremely dubious. The only argument I've heard made to that effect, the one saying, well, people may not like it, but it is actually benefiting them, is one that uses econometrics, which the guy who invented basically modern econometrics, Simon Kuznets, the guy who invented national product and GNP and all that, he was no Austro-libertarian, but he said, look, these numbers are basically, they don't show anything about well-being or anything. They just measure spending. That's all they do. And he was explicit that there's no basis whatsoever for just assuming that increased spending equals increased good or wealth or anything. It just means there's more spending. Measuring GDP means there's more spending. That's all it means. And that does not mean that you're having more wealth or better country or anything. That's the guy who invented the damn thing. It was invented just so the government could try and invent some way of, during the New Deal, of deciding whether it was having an effect or not. And that's it. I mean, it was literally a way for the government to attempt to validate itself. It would be like the Pharaoh hiring the high priest to do extipacy, which is when they extipacy is the name for when they examine livers of animals to find out what the will of the gods is. It'd be like the Pharaoh hiring a whole bunch of priests or whatever to perform extipacy to find out whether or not what he was doing was helping the Egyptian people. It's totally bullshit. It's totally bullshit. And you know that the priests that are working for the Pharaoh are going to come up with, oh, the gods favor what you're doing. Well, the use of econometrics to judge the efficacy of government expenditures is no more scientific than extipacy is. And the priests, aka the economists in this case, or the university professors, or the talking heads on Fox, or the media in general, since there are corporate entities as well, reliant on a government-granted oligopoly, they're the priests. They're working for the government, and they're using junk science that has no basis in reality to come to erroneous conclusions justifying government expenditures. That's what's really happening with public works.